Hi, I'm Ashlie Scott, Assistant Curator at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today, for this episode of Small Wonders, we will be talking about the unique history of toy trains and how their popularity spiked during the holiday season. When you think of toy trains, some of us imagine waking up on Christmas morning and seeing a little train set zooming around the bottom of the tree.
Every Christmas, kids have their favorite toys.
Midnight Flyer!
And every Christmas, one of them is a Lionel train. Why just give a toy when you can give a tradition? Lionel.
In our collection, we have a variety of toy trains. Some of them you can see on display in our research library. The connections we have with these trains dive deep into their history, but also the personal stories tied to them. Toy trains let children take their experiences and visions of trains into downscaled versions for them to play with at home. Toy trains came in a variety of scales and track gauges. This allowed a certain level of interchangeability with toy products. In the 1920s, Ives adopted something called Gauge 1, which had two rails spaced 1.75 inches apart. This gauge is the same as a modern G gauge. Lionel came up with a new offering that it called Standard Gauge, which actually utilized three rails, with the middle one serving as a power supply feed for electric trains. The width between the two outer rails was wider at 2.12 inches. Another popular train scale used was O gauge, for which the rails were spaced 1.25 inches apart. While gauges were important for the consumers making choices, many of the companies were initially not as concerned with building their sets to specific scales or ratios in terms of size. When modeling became popular in the 1950s, Lionel and American Flyer noticed and attempted to make their toy trains more realistic, even down to introducing new scales. American Flyer focused on a smaller scale known as S, and new types of tracks which were less toy-like and more realistic. For instance, Lionel introduced the Super O track, which while still using the three-rail system, made the appearance of that center rail less prominent. The primary difference between toy trains and scale models comes down to the desires of the end user. Scale models are expressed in terms of a ratio, or basically the proportion of a size as compared to the actual prototype. Modelers take measurements and note specific parts to replicate the prototypes down to the smallest detail. Some modelers will spend their time researching one railroad or region, while others would prefer to replicate a moment in history. Toys, on the other hand, were made to engage children and their families. Marketing for these toys in the early decades of the 1900s always involved a boy with his dad. Ives' company motto was "Ives Toys Make Happy Boys." At the time, it was boys and their fathers who would be spending most of the time building and playing with toy train sets. Girls weren't considered part of this demographic until the late 1950s. Regardless, all the toy companies were seen creating their own lines of locomotives. Cars, depots, you name it, just to give an extra creative spark to the boys and girls who played with them at home. New color schemes with colors like bright reds and yellows were used. Clockwork and push and pull trains shifted to electric sets. Sounds and lights and even pellets to create smoke from the smokestacks of the locomotives were introduced as the years went on to engage all senses for children. This allowed for imagination and endless play to grow. There have been toy trains ever since the introduction of railroads. One of the first toy companies to sell toy train sets was German company Marklin, starting in 1891. Its early toy trains were operated by a clockwork mechanism. Ives, toy maker in the United States, was one of the first to produce toy trains in America. It also utilized a clockwork mechanism to operate its trains. Starting in 1897, some companies switched over to electric trains, using batteries to power them at first. Lionel Corporation was founded in 1900 with the goal of making electric novelty devices such as fans. To advertise its products, founder Joshua Lionel Cohen used a motor from one of his fans to operate a battery-powered electric train. The trains would sit in shop windows, typically carrying an item the store wanted to highlight and sell more of. As these displays were seen in cities and stores, more individuals were interested in the trains themselves. As the demand grew to buy the trains, Lionel started to sell toy trains. Those were so popular that they became the main element of Lionel's business. Lionel's electric trains set the standard for the market, and Ives and American Flyer came up with their own versions of electric trains to compete. In the 1900s to the 30s, this decade saw companies like Ives, American Flyer, and Lionel competing with each other. Ives maintained its clockwork drive mechanism as other companies shifted to electric. Ives wanted to reach families who still didn't have electric power across the nation, but in 1928, Ives went out of business. Lionel and American Flyer purchased separate shares of the company. Ives was known for its detailed tins or cast molds. Those were still created and sold with the Ives name until it was slowly phased out. As the Great Depression rolled through the 1930s, all companies were finding it hard to prioritize selling sets when it was hard to simply sell individual pieces. One big seller for Lionel was its Mickey Mouse wind-up handcar that sold for just $1. It was a massive hit, especially for families, since it didn't break the bank, and it quite likely kept Lionel in business during these difficult years. In 1934, Louis Marks purchased Joy Line, changing the name of the business to Marks Trains. Marks proved to be quite the competition for both American Flyer and Lionel with its lower-cost trains, especially since these companies were recovering from the Great Depression. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, toy trains did really well overall, even more so with the introduction of plastic materials being used. Lionel continued to add accessories and upgrade features for its trains. Marketing began shifting from boys and dads to now include girls. Lionel specifically came out with the Lady Lionel set with colors to attract a female audience in pastel pinks, blues, and purples. As model trains grew in popularity starting in the 1950s, interest in toy trains was declining. This was also a result of the nation's railroad lines declining in prominence. As autos and jet airplanes became the dominant modes of travel, interest in toy trains kept diminishing. Model and toy trains were replaced with race cars, airplanes, and boats. Some of the toy companies began marketing for additions to their train sets, like race cars, but the popularity wasn't there. Not too far into the 1960s, the parent company of American Flyer, A.C. Gilbert Company, went bankrupt. Though Lionel purchased the rights to the American Flyer name in 1967, Lionel itself went bankrupt later that same year. General Mills picked the company up in 1969 with a few rebrandings under the Lionel name that saw minimal success. In 1977, the introduction of a Mickey Mouse Express train set boosted Lionel's popularity again, harkening back to the Depression-era Mickey Mouse handcar and keeping Lionel out of bankruptcy once more. Though Lionel and American Flyer went bankrupt in the late 1960s, nostalgia for toy trains helped them regain popularity as the baby boomers who grew up with toy trains sought these trains out again in the 1980s and 1990s. New companies introduced wood push and pull trains, allowing kids to expand their track into more custom builds. New companies like Fisher-Price and Brio created these mini wooden models for families to get creative with. Accessories made these toys easier for setup compared to their metal and electric predecessors. Lionel went through many parent company shifts after its original purchase by General Mills Incorporated, and saw success once more when it partnered with Warner Brothers to create trains based on the popular movie The Polar Express. The Polar Express is still a hit every Christmas, and you can find a Polar Express train set under trees today. Lionel is still in the market along with a few other companies that have grown over the past decade or two. The nostalgia of toy trains continues today, and it is still possible to purchase vintage Lionel, American Flyer, and other models at swap meets or through online marketplaces. The importance of toy trains and their history live on in the imaginations of children everywhere. Kids can get excited to lay down some track and add a conductor, a depot, some trees, and lights along the way for their own railroad adventure. All toy companies spent time creating new cars, engines, and accessories for kids to add to their own rail line. Lionel was known for introducing new types of cars during the 1960s when space exploration was at its height. Toy trains allowed kids and their families to sit with one another and imagine traveling to numerous places and seeing various sights. Most of this playtime with trains planted a seed with many to find their love in railroading, as well as finding a way to incorporate their love of trains into their lives as they got older. Here at the Colorado Railroad Museum, we like to showcase the history of many objects in our collection and strive to share their stories. The toy trains in our collection provide an insight into what life was like as a kid growing up in the age of railroads. The artifacts we have here are laced with memories and adventures of when they were played with at the time. You can see the love expressed through the wear and tear in the metal and paint of some of these cars. As a staff member here at the museum, I grew up with the wooden train sets, but many of our volunteers and some of our staff grew up with toy trains like the ones featured in this program. Please comment and share with us any fun facts or stories you have about any toy trains you might have grown up with. Thank you for watching.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.